you, Dr. Trotz, for such a wonderful beginning and really kind of resituating the themes yesterday as the necessary fuel that can energize us today. Thank you, Binta, as well, for welcoming us to the second day of the conference. And I really want to thank the Graduate Student Association for all of the labor of putting these important dialogues together. You know, yesterday was a success, particularly in laying out the political stakes of our gathering together, despite these bleak times, even the possibility of doing so across borders, time zones, and as Dr. Trotz, echoing Dr. Alexander, puts it, as an attempt to forge contingent epistemologies within multiple autobiographical itineraries. So I just look forward to learning again from the panels today, and I encourage folks to participate. So stay on, for the full day as we attempt to collectively glean what can still be possible, and as we map the convergences of feminist practices and theories from across disparate vantage points. On that note, it is with pleasure and excitement that I welcome Dr. Anjali Arondekar, Professor of Feminist Studies and Director for the Center of South Asian Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Dr. Arondekar's research engages the poetics and politics of sexuality, caste, and historiography with a focus on the Indian Ocean studies and South Asia. She is the author of an incredibly significant book, For the Record, on Sexuality and the Colonial Archive in India, published by Duke University Press in 2009 and Orient Black Swan in India in 2010. This monograph is the winner of the Alan Bray Memorial Book Award for the best book in lesbian, gay, or queer studies in the Literature and Cultural Studies from the Modern Language Association in 2010. She's also co-editor of a very influential special issue with Geeta Patel of GLQ, Journal of Lesbian and Gay Studies, on Area Impossible, the Geopolitics of Queer Studies. Her forthcoming book, Abundance, Sexuality, Historiography, Geopolitics, grows out of her interest in the figurations of sexuality, caste, and capital in colonial British and Portuguese India. On a more personal note, I have known Dr. Arundekar for more than a decade now, and across this period of time, I've been truly inspired by her commitment to enliven the knowledges that exist across multiple South-South formations, knowledges which she also embodies as a scholar, mentor, and transnational migrant. She is thus a fitting guide as we think today through the kinds of commitments those of us from the global South can still make as we reframe our uneven histories, communities, and knowledges in ways that matter. The title for talk is Archival Fragments, Gomantak Maraja Samaj. Dr. Arundekar.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you to Ferdi, Binta, and all the other graduate students who've been part of it. I was tempted to ask Professor Trotz to keep speaking because I was learning so much from her invocations. But I want to begin first by saying Jai Bhim to all, which is a call to the elders who come before us. I'm a Bahujan lower caste person, and if you've been following the news, our communities are doing worse than usual in South Asia. I also want to begin, before I start reading, to talk about something that happened in my last visit home, which was right before the pandemic hit in March 2020, where there were mass-scale protests in India, particularly led against the Citizen Amendment Act, which was a discriminatory and racist act targeting minority communities, especially lower caste, Muslim, and trans communities. And one of the rallying calls of those protests, many of which I attended and of course were shut down by the surveillance modality of the ongoing pandemic, one of the anthems of that those protests was Hum Kagaz Nahi Dikhayenge, which is Hindi or Hindustani for "We will not show our papers." And the anthem was in response to the government's determination or mandate for people to prove who they are. And one of the responses from minority communities was, we refuse to follow your evidentiary mandates. We refuse to be made visible in the language of laws. And in many ways, the talk that I'm going to give, which is called Abundance, is about these kinds of mandates and the refusal of these mandates, and what are the ways in which subaltern communities put up a different epistemology of arrival, as it were. So I'll begin. Towards the middle of my talk, I will show you some images from the archives I'm working on. I work primarily in non-English archives, so if there are people in the audience who read Devanagari or Urdu, you might see some familiar refrains. Okay, without further ado. To write a history of sexuality, or so the story goes, is to embrace the chimeric prose of paucity and plenitude. If the present is marked by an inescapable surfeit of evidence, the past is haunted by an unremitting loss of materials. Marginality and loss, paucity and disenfranchisement. These are the hermeneutical forms that have become the common currencies of histories of sexuality, especially within the Global South. The missing amphora of sexuality is recovered from the archival detritus of hegemonic histories of slavery, colonialism, and nationalism to showcase even more liberatory narratives of emancipation, liberation, and rights. Even scholars of pre-colonial histories of sexuality in South Asia, for example, who rightfully bemoan the temporal focus on 19th century European colonialism, call upon a similar language of loss as they lament the post-colonial erasure of a historical archive resplendent with evidence of sexuality's past. Tropes of loss especially abound in queer historiographical work in the Euro-American Academy, where sexuality's putatively pathologized pasts and archives are recuperated as reparative sources of sanctuary rather than despair. Now, to note the orthodoxy of such theorizations about histories of sexuality is not to dismiss the considerable productivity of such thinking. If anything, it is more gestural of a larger critical ecology as evidence and evocation of the collective pull of loss across geopolitical landscapes. After all, archival economies of loss are always already at work in the worlds we seek to enter as an excruciating double bind that indentures us to the very historical holdings we seek to release. And these questions have immense amplification within the current climate of the pandemic, particularly for those of us who work on histories of subaltern pasts. And I'm happy to say more anon. Queer subjects, especially in elusive subaltern pasts of places like India and Pakistan, the two regions I work in, remain in the stranglehold of constant precarity, even as they stumble towards pragmatic, entrepreneurial, often legal structures of survival. In the face of the casual brutality of dispersed global suffering, there is nothing spectacular to report about loss anymore. This goes back to what Professor Trotz was saying about Professor Alexander's talk, sort of the ordinariness and the persistence of loss. Indeed, any privileging of loss, past or present, assumes an eventfulness that flounders in the face of the ordinary, chronic, and cruddy syncopations of everyday subaltern life. Now, my talk today challenges such an epistemological preoccupation of loss as the mode of narration through which we come alive. To fix, for example, histories of sexuality within such archival vernaculars of loss, while politically exigent, is to elide alternative historiographical models, to bypass imaginative histories of sexuality full of intrepid archives and acts of invention. Today, I want to set the two terms, history and sexuality, both alongside and athwart one another, to stage a different story, one that seeks to discover what each of these terms might do to the other without assuming a position of negation from the outset. At its most ambitious, I invite you to two sets of ruminations. What if we are to shift our attention from the recuperation of sexuality and subaltern pasts as loss to understanding it rather as a site of abundance? What are the archival forms and effects that emerge from such a coupling of sexuality, subalternity with abundance? To enter histories of sexuality through an imaginary of abundance is not to invest in and stabilize a new knowledge economy of plenitude, or to slide into plodding literalization. There is more, more, mislaying in the process the messy misalignments the concept of abundance lugs along. Bypassing salvific modes, not refusing them, but bypassing them, underwritten by loss's value, abundance for me serves more as a theoretical than descriptive supplement, as a concept metaphor that moves us away from the incessant shuttling between the sated fulfillment and avid impoverishment of historiographical ambitions. Vulgarly stated, the concept of abundance I am proposing does not replace paucity with overflow, but rather unravels a set of questions that are fertile ground for producing and contesting our attachments to history writing. One way to pass the concept of abundance I am proposing here is to see it as inextricably linked to the histories of subordinated collectivities, as a historiographical orientation that challenges the narratives of their constant devaluation. What historical forms, I want to ask, does abundance take when we turn to subaltern peoples and paths? How do such forms of abundance fall outside historical interest and preservation? How might a turn to abundance work against the imperative to fix sexuality within wider structures of vulnerability, damage, and loss, especially in the global South? Indeed, much of what I want to say invites a movement away from the recursive dialectic of fulfillment and impoverishment as a pathway to futurity. What happens if minoritized collectivities anticipate such accretions of loss and curate archives that activate the profits that such losses should or will produce, rather than dismiss the pull of loss within sexuality and subaltern studies? I am pushing here for a more strategic and subaltern archival pragmatism, produced in many ways an archival pragmatism that extracts value from the hegemonic historical form. The hegemonic historical form is that lost archives need to be found for future gains, precisely to attenuate these very modes of recuperation. Now, my efforts here amplify recent scholarship within caste, slavery, and indigenous studies that have also chosen to refuse this mandate of show and tell and lost and found historical scripts. That these trenchant challenges to our consumption of times past have overwhelmingly come from scholars working on histories of minoritization that are attentive to archival economies of paucity and devaluation is hardly surprising. Now, today I'm going to draw from intellectual traditions within two entangled and often segregated histories, one in area studies, South Asian studies, and the other in sexuality studies. What would histories of sexuality, I want to ask, look like if interrogated as histories of regions? As many African scholars have argued, how does thinking in place, thinking with geohistory, produce knowledge? To that end, I've also deliberately used the word sexuality, for the most part, in lieu of queer, to gather epistemologies and interlocutors across geopolitical sides that are not always poised to offer political salvation or even seen as queer. Sexuality here is not staged as a counter-narrative or corrective to queer. Rather, for me, it serves more as an itinerant heuristics that culls a density of semantic forms across divergent spatialities and temporalities. Now, in what follows, I'm going to get to my archive now. I want to turn to an archive of sexuality where the language of loss has slipped into the granular smoothness of the everyday, breaking with its centrality as a heuristic origin story. If at first glance, the ethical responsibility of an archive is to host worlds that may otherwise be lost, in the end, I want to suggest its central obligation may be to provide worlds that may never have left. What to make then of an archive of sexuality that resists recuperative historiography's most cherished mantra: recover, restore, redress? Rather, the archive I will produce here is an abundant ecosystem, at once imaginative and real, less a record keeper of lost lives, but more a potential epistemology for how we know, translate, and amplify our relationship to the past. Okay, section 1, RIP, return if possible. That tone is a nod to growing up in a divided Hindu-Muslim India, where whenever we went to cemeteries where Christians were buried, as Hindus and Muslims, we always thought of RIP not as rest in peace, but as return if possible because of reincarnate. So that's a nod to that in some ways. Okay, July 14th, 2009. Tumhi kai karta, madam? What are you doing, madam? This was the question that the caretaker of the Gomantak Maratha Samaj archives in Panaji, Goa, quizzically asked me as I painstakingly placed a fragile archival document into one of my many Ziploc bags. The Gomantak Maratha Samaj, henceforth I will refer to it as Samaj, is a prominent lower caste Devadasi collectivity hailing from colonial Portuguese and British India. Devadasi is a Sanskrit term literally meaning slave, dasi, of a god, master, deva, often falsely read as interchangeable with terms such as courtesan, sex worker, and prostitute. Gomantak, from the Gomantak Maratha Samaj, speaks to geographical roots in Goa, which is in Western South Asia. Maratha is a caste and regional denomination, and Samaj literally translates to both collectivity, reform, society, and or community. Now, bemused by my efforts to preserve these rare archival materials that I perceived as being damaged to loss, the caretaker's question, "What are you doing?" signaled an unforeseen twist in my orientation to archival research. For the caretaker, the preservation of these rare archival materials was of little consequence. After all, as she sternly reminded me, this is an oversaturated archive, full at its seams that it struggles to manage the constant production of new and diverse materials. Here, the return to sexuality was not through a call to loss of object or materials, but rather through ordinary surplus. When asked about the potential loss of valuable historical materials, the response from the archival custodian was one full of mirth and consternation. For her, the risk of loss is more ek hasaichi goshta, a laughable matter, where the preservation of rare archival materials is of little consequence. We have more materials than we need. Zaruri peksha jasta, she adds, shaking her head in amused exasperation at my continued insistence on the looming dangers of loss. To this day, she reminds me proudly, new materials continue to enter the Samaj archives with little effort expended to either digitalize or republish older or more fragile materials. Now remember, this is an archive of a community that is defined by its history of sexuality and is a lower caste Dalit Bahujan community. So it is subaltern in every context. Scene 2, July 20th, 2014. On a rainy monsoon afternoon, a woman rushes into the Mumbai branch of the same Gomantak Maratha Samaj. My first scene is in Goa. This scene is from Mumbai in Maharashtra, where I'm again busy wading through boxes of archival material. A sheaf of papers in hand, this woman runs into the door, approaches the general factotum, and asks to see the chitnis, the secretary of the institution. She is in urgent need of a written affidavit from the Samaj, an evidentiary marker, she states, that can then be used to procure an OBC and other backward caste certificate for her son to attend university on a seat reserved for lower caste communities. It is a much more robust version of the affirmative action process in the US, which has failed. In India, it's called the reservation system. The secretary of the Samaj arrives, listens patiently to the woman's request, and gently reminds her that a letter from the Samaj no longer carries much legal weight due to stricter regulations on caste verification materials. The rise in cases of false caste certificates, he tells us, has made collectivities such as the Samaj suspicious record keepers of caste histories and open to charges of caste fabrication. After all, he tells her with some amusement, we have trouble proving who we are. Yet the woman insists that a letter authenticating her son's lower caste status will help, and so the chitnis, the secretary, pulls out the requisite form and begins to fill out the necessary information. But surely, the woman asks, you must want to see my son's birth certificate. Surely, she asks, you must want some evidence of my claims. Ah, says the secretary, we don't need any evidence. We don't need to see your papers. All we ask, he adds, is your permission to list your name in our annual published record of proud members. Amche karya tumcha vishwas. We make you believe, he notes with a wry smile. The woman listens to the secretary's request, pauses, gathers her papers, and quietly walks out the door. No caste certificate is exchanged. Section 2. Translation as transaction. Now, the two archival scenes I described above animate in many ways the historical ambitions of most of my research. What are the evidentiary mandates that provoke histories of subalternity into presence? How do we become visible? What happens when such mandates go awry, flouted by the radical pragmatism of subaltern evidentiary practices? Bear in mind that in both scenes, there is no renunciation or refusal of evidentiary value of the archives or of the historical demands placed on minoritized communities. After all, the caretaker of the Goa branch in the first scene acknowledges the Samaj's commitment to archival production. For example, the hegemonic historical form. We need archives to prove that we exist. We keep producing, she says. Just as the secretary in the second scene of the Mumbai branch cannily speaks to the necessary visibility that such evidentiary forms can produce, the public list of members in exchange for the caste certificates. Together, the archival events foreground the compensatory economies of archival formations, archives as guarantors of presence, rights, and representations for minority communities. The conventions of evidentiary genres, in this case, the caste certificate that we need to garner contractual rights and freedoms, a caste certificate that we have already noted is constantly under siege as a verifiable marker. And third, the imaginative yet transactive refusal of such prescriptions, the epistemological liveness of the two scenes that speaks to riskier sorts of historical engagement. In the first scene, for example, we have the story of a collectivity that stubbornly refuses to move on from the ordinary plenitude of sexuality. Shorn of the aura of loss, we are confronted here with a story, a historiography that refuses to give up the paradoxes instantiated in its self-archiving. Presence without preservation, production without reproduction. Remember, the woman says to me, what are you doing? Why do you want to preserve? We are not invested in preservation. We are invested in presence without preservation. As the caretaker of the Samaj reminds me, there is no dearth of materials and as such, no inheritance of loss, the mandate that we live through. Rather than safeguard against the inevitable destruction of fragile archival materials, the caretaker's obiter dicta folds archival surplus into an unexceptional consistency. More materials, we are told, keep coming in. Archival abundance here does not merely signify a surfeit of materials, but more a deliberately embraced historical project. In all its ostensible substance, we have so much, the Samaj archive displays an errant materiality, that remarkably eschews the exigency of preservation. Now, the Samaj and the caretakers' disinterest in the reproduction of the Samaj archives through digitalization, for example, they're not interested in digitalization, equally stanches cherished archival roots of aspirational value. The digitalization of minority archives, we are endlessly reminded, and for the most part, and I am part of that constant mantra, safeguard against the risk of lost value, especially within the treacherous landscapes of post-colonial worlds that we inhabit. As such, the Samaj's lack of investment in digitalized pasts and futures speaks further to an almost counterintuitive embrace of archival abundance, a refused relation to the valued reproductive imperative. And that, in many ways, if you will, is the queer form, is the refusal of normative reproductivity in terms of knowledge formation. In contrast to the imperative to immure and preserve materials through digitalization, the Samaj archives appears instead to be focused on the sustenance of an archive whose abundant productions negotiate an unexpected pathway to futurity. What remains instead is the promise and failure of archival recuperation, the looking for and a historiography about found archival objects that are so plentiful that one must look askance. Now, in the second archival encounter, conventions of verification, tell us, prove. Remember when I started with hum kaagaz nahi dikhayenge, we will not show our papers. It's a refusal to the conventions of verification. The uncertainty of the original evidentiary form is writ large, even as claims to the future are sought by the secretary, we need to publish your name, and refused by the woman because she doesn't want to be exposed. Now, as many scholars in South Asia, such as Amrit Rai and Lawrence Cohen, have variously argued, the logic of the jugaad, the duplicate, founds the very evidentiary models of the colonial, post-colonial state. And I know there are many comrades here who are from such post-colonial worlds. Even as colonial, post-colonial subjects recognize themselves through the bureaucratic and evidentiary regimes of the colonial stamp state, they equally understand those regimes to be flexible and inherently provisional. The copy duplicate of the original evidentiary marker, in this case, the birth certificate, the caste certificate, crucially become the bearer of value such that the distinction between the proper and the spurious is always held in abeyance. The original opens itself up to the threat of destruction, whereas the copy, the duplicate, the jugaad, continues to accrue in value through its constant reproduction. In the second archival event, the secretary's caution around the inherent falseness of the caste certificate, we have trouble proving who we are, he says, does not summon unreliability as a salvational resolution. Rather, his provocation, "Amse karne tumsa vishwas," we make you believe, captures the transactive value in the evidentiary form. It is solely through such an understanding that the desired caste certificate can function in its proper form. Now, the two archival events also speak directly to the ways in which minoritized collectivities assemble archival technologies of presence and absence, what I would call make-believe, to bypass our attempts to make coherent the heady confluence of uneven imagines that compromise and comprise the lives of caste and sexuality. At the heart of all of these struggles is an uncertainty, a foundational unreliability in how evidentiary regimes guarantee forms of legal, economic, and social freedom. If we cannot prove without legal doubt the exchange value of caste and sex, how can we then transact a liberatory project? But before I go further, I need to bring you closer to the historical stage on which my questions unfold. What and where is this subaltern archive that promises abundance and courts the freedom of make-believe? I'm going to share my screen with you. This section is called Come Again. even as the most historical study fears getting into trouble, less with the histories it displaces and decenters than through what it might be perceived as an overall lack of proper evidence. Nothing expresses this convention of proving that we exist better than the history of a minoritized community within an inherently paradoxical archival economy, at once empty and full. An essential characteristics of such conventions is that the history far exceeds the official archives within which it is circumcised. That, and I use that word very carefully, that is, the absence within official archives attests to the collectivity's enduring historical presence and therefore necessitates the search for missing and lost archives. In what follows, I want to recalibrate such histories of historical writing to shift the emphasis from what is missing towards a recognition of what is. The history of the Samaj I will offer here satisfies a double exigency: how to produce abundance entirely outside of any official and/or state archive, and at the same time, how to preserve the effects of that archive within its own production. All right, let me go to my... So this is the first... So I'm going to begin with a map. I'm not a huge fan of maps, but in this case, a lot of people, even those who work in South Asia, are very sort of lowly informed about the history of Portuguese India. So what and where is this subaltern archive that eschews ready-made parts and courts the freedom of abundance and make-believe? The Gomantak Mahara Samaj, as I noted, is a Devadasi diaspora. Remember, the term Devadasi literally means slave of a god and is often understood as prostitute, courtesan, and sex worker. That this is a diaspora, this is a Devadasi diaspora that moved between Portuguese and British India between roughly 1860 and 91. Now, so Goa is right here. It's a tiny little enclave in a broad swath of British India. Now, Devadasi, as I've already told you, is a term that functions across South Asia. Though Samaj was established as a community formation by Devadasis and their kin in 1927 in Goa and Maharashtra, western states of India, and officially became a charitable institution in 1936, moving back and forth between Portuguese and British India, roughly between 1860 and 1961. Now, for many of you, the history of colonialism in South Asia is often dominated by British India or British South Asia, but it's important to remember that the Portuguese were in India for over 450 years. They only departed in 1961, whereas the British left in 1947. So this is a very important detail about the enduring legacy of an empire and about the importance of South-South conversations within the post-colonial world. So for many Goans, and my family is Goan, Goa is often referred to as a colony of a post-colony, because the liberation of Goa from the Portuguese by many is seen as an affront to the rights of the Goans, because it was the liberated state of India that forcibly liberated the Goans from the Portuguese. There's a lot more to say about that, but I just want to give you a little bit of a background. So the 1902 census of Goa, for example, notes that there are over 150 to 200,000 members of this community working and surviving in various towns and villages. The Samaj, very importantly, continues its activities to this day and has from its inception maintained a community of 50,000 to 100,000 registered members. Often described in India as Bharatatil ek aggressor Samaj, an aggressive lower caste community in India, this Devadasi diaspora is routinely lauded by the left and right in India for its self-reform and progress. Two extraordinary features make this Samaj important for us today. It is unabashedly celebratory of its past and present history of sexuality, and it is the only Devadasi community and the only community of Sexuality that maintains its own extensive and continuous historical archive. Unlike the familiar histories of loss that accompany the excavation of minority lives, the archive of this collectivity offers a radically different relationship to the past. Now, I wanted to begin with this image because it's important to note that there are multiple registers of archival representation at work within the history of the Samaj. Now, this is an image from the Portuguese archives in Lisboa, and this is an image of a Devadasi or a bailadeira, which is the Goan Portuguese word for dancer or courtesan. And this is a very stylized image that you find in a lot of Portuguese journals of the time, which describes these Devadasis and portrays them in this very stylized genre, which any of you working on sort of colonial photography, etc., will recognize the gaze, the way the woman is seated, looking away from the camera. And this is one of the most circulated journals. I want you to keep this in mind as an official, one of the rare official images of this community in the colonial archives, and then contrast it or juxtapose it against the images from the Samaj itself. So this is another image from a colonial Portuguese archive, which is a standard sort of census album of the who's who. And you will see right here, it says Uma Bailadeira. If there are any Portuguese speakers in the audience, and if my accent sounds strange, it's because it's a Goan Portuguese accent, which does not sound anything like the Brazilian or the Portuguese from Portugal. So you'll see here the Uma Bailadeira. And from my, for Robert, you will see right here, it is a seller from Manila. Just this is a shout out to my Pinay, Pinoy, and all my other brethren. Okay. Now, on the other hand, as I said, there are these public archives that constitute the image of these bailadeiras, these Devadasis in a certain way. Yet these archives are largely generated by non-Samaj members and rarely include information or references on the membership of these singers to the Samaj and routinely elide any attachment to histories of sexuality. Mostly hagiographical in voice. Now, many of the members of this community constitute the who's who of Indian classical music. So many of these Devadasis were also singers. And if you're interested in Indian classical music, you'll note that many of the members of this community are from this lower caste community. But even as these singers are celebrated, like Lata Mangeshkar, for example, who is often referred to the Nightingale of India, while these singers are celebrated in hagiographical terms, no mention is made of their attachment, membership, and presence in this particular Samaj, right? So mostly hagiographical, these archives of voice and sound have routinely utilized to address the centrality of the arts and not any reference to sexuality. Indeed, the energetic circulation of these archives of music, which elide the Samaj's own archives, have guaranteed that the presence of the Samaj endures. So on the one hand, the Samaj is relevant and visible in mainstream South Asia, but primarily as the repository of music and value, and all of these other histories and its own archives remain unexamined. Alternatively, the Samaj's own archives are massively messy and contain multiple genres of archival records in Marathi, Konkani, Portuguese, and Kannada, ranging from minutes of meetings, journals, private correspondences, flyers, programs, replete with the minutiae of everyday life in the Samaj. Such efflorescence appears startling, almost jarring, if you recall my opening scenes, pushing against archival expectations of absence and erasure. The Samaj archives, now this is very important, are housed in open collections in brick and mortar buildings in Mumbai, Bombay, and Panaji, and have always been made available for public viewing since their formation in 1929. Now, I have spent almost 12 years or so reading and sitting with these materials, and I've only read about 40 to 50% of the available materials. In fact, the Samaj's incitement to archive, as previously mentioned, is only surpassed by its disinterest, as I also noted, in the preservation or even curious visitors' request for rare materials. Now, one of the important things to note is if you work in subaltern archives, particularly if you work in archives of the past in any part of the post-colonial world, and I have worked in different regions, it's usually very hard to get to them, or they're unavailable, or there's enormous bureaucratic hurdles to be crossed. In this case, any one of you can go in, they will offer you a cup of tea, and you can look at the materials, and they will leave you alone, which is very counterintuitive to the narrative of oppositionality and access that we are so accustomed to finding. And yet, despite their availability, none of these archives have been looked at or read. And I'm interested in thinking about why we are not looking at materials that are available of a community of sexuality whose history will teach us so much. What is the reluctance to engage? And I think the reluctance to engage is precisely this refusal to prescribe to the historical script of preservation and minoritization through a script of loss, okay? Now, a second important feature of the Samaj, let me just say a little bit about the slide that you're seeing. This is a slide of the first rule book, the first constitution that came out of the Samaj. And if you can see, it has this weird quotation here from Tennyson. And that's part of the Samaj's archives. They're a mix and match of all kinds of things. They sort of borrow, copy, repeat without heed to source or function. And on the top it says, Gomantak Maratha Samaj, Mumbai, Sthapana, established 1927. This is also more of the rule book. It tells you rules of behavior, what you can do. It has things like you can't stamp your foot and walk away. You have to stay and engage, but it also has more interesting details. I'm showing you this to give you the scale of the minutiae so that you understand the largesse and the largeness of this archive. This is the certificate of registration when it becomes a charitable foundation under the British colonial state in Mumbai and the Portuguese colonial state. Now, I want to stay with this image as well. Now, a key second feature of the Samaj archives is the relative paucity of veracity genres, such as memorials, testimonials, and biographies. Indeed, before I get to that, let me say a little bit about this image. This image counterpoints the image that I showed you in the beginning of the very staged picture from the Portuguese archives of the woman, very beautiful, but looking away from the camera. This is an image from the Samaj archives, which is a calling card that is used by the Devadasis to procure yajmans or patrons. And if you notice at the bottom, it says rendezvous, and the woman looks directly at the camera, and she is not physically readable in the same legislative beauty of upper caste beauty that you would find in the other image. Now, these are also images of the journals of the Samaj that continue to be published to this day. So remember, they start publishing as early as the 1890s, and they continue to this day. Every month, there is still a newsletter published. Now, these journals, pictures that I'm going to show you, are from the 1930s and the 40s. And most of these images have, most of these journals have an image of a woman who is kicking a rock. And this rock has in it named a particular upper caste crime. Because most of the people who are responsible for oppressing this community vis-a-vis their lower caste labor are members of upper caste Brahmin communities. So most of these images you'll see are about kicking or pushing away the rock of hegemony and the rock of Brahmanism. Now, these images I'm going to get to in a minute, but I want to say a little bit more about the fact that the privileged archival genre of these archives is not testimonials or memoirs, as one would assume in any self-archive. There's only one biography which I've written about, and that biography is also based on an event that never happened, an event that was staged by the community so that they could accrue rights. Now, the privileged archival genre is fiction. Now, fiction provides the vitalizing properties of the archive, deliberately rooting the demand for archival presence from conventional evidentiary genres to more imaginative modes of production. Now, more confounding also is the Samaj's relationship to principles of archival provenance and circulation, meaning how and when we access them. But before I get to them, I want to show you these images. Now, these images are taken from the 1940s, and again, they're covers of journals of the Samaj. As you'll notice, these images are also incredibly stylized and also very beautiful in some ways, but they are very, very audacious, and they engage with the camera. Even this one, which is looking askance in a way, is also staged in a way that the image is front and center. Another important detail about these images, which go on, you'll see in this, this is my favorite because she's playing tennis. It's an aspirational form. All of these images, if you look at the journals, we are not told who these women are. Now, this is an important detail for me because it continues the logic of make-believe that I began with. Many of the elders that I've spoken to in this community look at these images and say, we all know who these women are, therefore they do not need to be named. So this idea of a shared relationship to an image without it being named is a very different order of representation than the kind of colonial census model where we see images of, you know, brown folks in costume or barely clad, and we are told a seller in India or a dancer in India. In this case, the anonymity functions as a form of ownership. We enter into the image knowing familiarity without being able to pinpoint, without being able to verify who these women are. And I've spent a lot of time, and that's where my sort of traditional historian role comes in, trying to find out who these women are. Then I realized that's precisely besides the point. Okay. This is another image from another series of where you always have images of domesticity without any male presence, right? It's always the woman, and there are no men in sight, which is again a super important point. Now, let me turn a little bit more to this one editorial, which was actually written by my father. If there are any here who can read, it says Ramakant Arundekar at the end, and this was written by him when he was 16 years old and head of the student brigade of this community. And the editorial is in some ways proleptically sort of talking about queer kinship. The editorial asks, who are we? And asks why we should surrender to the logic of biological determinism. So the editorial says, here we are being asked to love our mothers because we don't know who our fathers are, because this community is a community of Devadasis whose patrons were usually men of higher castes who they did not marry. So he says, why should we love our mothers? Why should we be forced to love our mothers? Why cannot we choose who we love? And this refrain also continues. Now, this is the only biography, as I mentioned, that's present in the archives, which is called Mikon, again, Who Am I?, written by Rajaram Rangoji Paingankar. And the biography, as I noted, is built on a fiction. And everybody knows it's a fiction, but yet everybody celebrates the fiction. All right. Now I'm going to end with this, but before I end, let me just set it up for you. I'm almost done. Thank you for your patience. So more confounding still is the Samaj's relationship to principles of archival circulation. That is, how does the Samaj's archive become visible, gather value, mediating the imaginative leap from historical record to historical truth? Even as histories of minoritization embrace the munificent returns of the archival turn, less attention is paid to the material organization of archives, their evidentiary genres, and the multiple problems of access and circulation. As I have repeatedly noted here, the archives of the Samaj have not been read, circulated, or memorialized beyond a repeated reference to them being an aggressive, successful Samaj. Such a historical elision is particularly telling because there's no mystery, as I noted, surrounding access. In the story of the Samaj, archival surplus repeats itself in a historical calculus so minor that it does not appear to excite historical recuperation. As a historian colleague recently at an unnamed institution asked me with great exasperation when I gave a talk, why is this not just a failed archive? If it has not been read, he said, and is so evidently available, surely there must be nothing there. The Samaj's provenance thus marks both archival abundance and historical minoritization. It is at once removed from the archival mandates that govern histories, even as it is intimately acquainted with them and their most subtle efforts on history writing. So we have archival abundance in its literal sense, but we have historical elision in that because it is abundant, no one wants to read it. Herein lies the paradox. Now let me end then with one last fragment of make-believe from the archives. Now, as I noted, one of the ways in which the Devadasis are mentioned in the census right up to 1930s, maybe I forgot to mention it, but one of the categories through which they're mentioned is a word called Adha Bhakti or Adha Bhakti, which in Urdu, Hindustani means half slave. So because they were considered slaves to the master was supposed to be God, but often became interchanged with the Yajman, the patron to whom they offered their services. They often referred to and counted as slaves up to the 1920s and 30s, which is quite late given histories of abolition, right? So contained within these Samaj archives, there are also 500 documents called Khareed Patra, letters of sale, from colonial Goa and Bombay that note the relationship of a Devadasi with one or two patrons dated between 1906 to 1926, excuse me. What is curious about such letters of sale is that they bypass the subject property nexus that is the staple form of engaging histories of sexuality. Rather than the letters speak of the desis, the subject's worth, mulya in a language of capitalization that requires the yajman to provide a guarantee as part of the sale. Now, for example, one Vimal, age 16, is sold to Sushil Kakodkar in 1903 with a guarantee that he will provide independent lodging and board for her and any offspring she may have and provide her a monthly stipend of rupees 50. Each letter highlights, each Khareed Patra, each letter of sale highlights a kala, a talent that needs to be nurtured and freed through the exchange with the Yajman. Now, the Khareed Patra that I found was dated 1903. Now, 43 years later, the same Vimal whose Khareed Patra I found appears yet again in this document that I'm showing. This document, if there are any of you who read Portuguese, it's Portuguese in the left side and Marathi on the right. It is a Mrityu Patra, a will. So 43 years later, the same Vimal appears once again in 1955 amidst the archival fragments of the Samaj, this time in the context of a will left by Vimal Shirodkar, a prominent Goan Devadasi. The will, written in both Portuguese and Marathi, bypasses the conventional language of lineage and inheritance. Instead, Vimal uses the form of the will. The will is over 10 pages long to chart the histories of her community. The will systematically names her many patrons and lists the multiple properties and related acquisitions acquired through these relationships. Each property, we are told, has been procured through a separate bill of sale. She is sold and resold, and in the process of resold, acquires a guarantee from the patron. And as her value grows, Vimal writes, with a clear sense of irony, so does her ability to buy and sell. Her kin, she writes in this letter, Mazhe Parivar, she lies in her network of sales spread through Goa. She provides us very specific histories of where her community is, sowing seeds of profit and pleasure. It is only at the end of this itinerant, in the literal sense document, her final bill of sale, if you will, her final Khareed Patra, we are told that Vimal's 3 daughters would receive equal share. The last line of the will reads, Mazhe mulya maze now, my value, my name. Okay, to conclude, I began my talk with a summoning of a history of sexuality that eschews the language of loss. The historical inheritance of loss, as is now obvious, is formidably recursive and iterative. Loss and paucity provide the warp and woof of a better future, all the more so when they carry the promise that if such deficits are erased, we who are subjected to both can somehow be redeemed. And in every plangent iteration of this promise, the burdens of minoritization demand archives and histories that must equally proffer arguments for their survival. Under these circumstances, when minoritized subjects have so effectively absorbed and struggled with the lineaments of loss, it becomes even more urgent to ask, what kind of historiography do we want? A historiography I would respond, that breaks with such moribund conventions and summons more abundant and joyful lineages. I have now spent over a decade reading the materials in this archive, and on every visit I leave wondering how to develop a reading practice that breaks with the presumptions of recuperative historiography. How to narrate the workings of this subaltern archive without scripting it within liberal heroic tropes of visibility and progress. After all, from what we know from its own available records, the Samaj conceived of its archive as a space of living reading gathering. The Samaj's penchant for accumulating materials was and continues to refuse the mandate for preservation or reproduction. Rather, we have an archive that exists to exist, compelling its readers to linger, to stumble, get bored, digress, before the demand for historical utility takes over. Here, the sanctum sanctorum of historical research, the archive becomes a place of open encounters and telling tales. Instead of scavenging the detritus of the past for genealogies of the present, we are invited instead to dwell in archives as spaces of chancy deliberation than cathartic revelation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Arundekar. I have my own questions because there's a lot of really great provocations that, as a queer studies scholars who work on a scholar who works on the Global South, I can see so many questions already percolating, and indeed, wow, as Jay Grant mentioned. But let us open it up to questions. First, I think I want to give the audience time. So we'll spend around 10 to 15 minutes. Questions from the audience. I have my own, like I said, but I think it's good to just begin us, for folks who might be interested in taking this time and getting questions in. Any questions from anyone that you'd like to send our way? Please do so via the chat log, and I will then ask Dr. Arundekar. I actually have a question that was texted to me by a student, one of my students. I just wanted to read it. So, and I think this kind of kind of connects to my question, because as a kind of elephant in the room, I think in the kind of talk is a real challenging of both the epistemological and methodological role the Global South plays, right, within kind of certain disciplinary formations, let's say like queer studies. And so my question was really thinking through this archival pragmatism is also a choice, right? So when that violent moment, a scholar tells you what's there is nothing there. That is actually a choice, right? To actually say it in this particular way. So the student's question is, how does the work of translative reiterative value of loss in the transfer from the original to target language ironically convey a plenitude of significations policed, disciplined by imperial and imperious academic gatekeepers in particular fields? Like, that's the question that the student had asked.
Would you like me to answer or take more questions?
I think for now there's that's one question, and then folks can just keep posting, and then I will.
I would also say that thank you. That I know I sort of bombarded you with a lot of geography, but part of what I'm also trying to do, and I think Robert knows this, is my commitment, and this is also going to be a indirect way of answering the question. My commitment has always been to thinking geopolitics as an epistemology and not as an exemplar, right? Mm-hmm. So as you're sort of, drowning in my prose, one of the things I want you to think about is, what do you remember and what do you not remember, right? What are the things that you grasp as epistemology and what do you grasp as historical detail? And part of what I'm, doing, and this is an excerpt from the introduction of my book, which will be out next year, is to try to figure out a way to not be able to tell both of those differences, right? So even how the archive is constituted is an epistemological form, just as our theorizations of it, right? So I think that's an important distinction. So if you ask me a question about, can you tell me more about Portuguese colonialism? That could be a historical question, but it's also an epistemological question because it determines the ways in which I will tell you that story. Right, which is very different. So the story of Portuguese Empire will be a story of an empire that failed. And I can say more about that or not, right? So to go back to the question of translation, I think you're quite right. There is a way when the kinds of surveillance or policing or curtailing of registers of translation also adds to this mythology of loss. And I think part of what we want to do is address those questions. But what I also want to suggest is that nothing I'm saying here is extraordinary, right? It's really, really important for all of you, especially graduate students and my colleagues and comrades. This is a lesson in humility, right? I have learned to understand that nothing of what I'm saying is extraordinary. If you talk to people who work in minority archives or like my Dalit comrades, right? Everything that I'm saying to them is commonsensical. There is always a lot of history there, right? And this is an argument that oral historians, feminist historians, indigenous. Now, the reason why I am interested in this archive is because I am in conversation with them, but I'm focusing deliberately on archive that's textual, right? There's a lot of paper. Why? Because like my uncle, you know, the white uncle who said to me, girl, this ain't an archive, right? Why? Because he was like, nobody reading it. So why is it an archive? And I'm like, why are you not reading it, right? Because it's there. So part of what I'm trying to really get you all to think about is, you know, don't refuse textuality, right? Textuality is part of the ephemera. This is an archive that has all the genres that one would find in an archive, but the genres are made up, right? The guy, any one of y'all can go in there and say, hey, I want to be a member of your community. The guy will be like, okay, let me write you a little certificate, right? So he's saying, look, I get that you and I can't be friends in this legal industry without that certificate. But we know that that certificate is BS, right? It's a production of a state that believes in the evisceration of people like you and me. Right, so I think that's the point I'm trying to make about abundance, right? This abundance is textual deliberately for me because I'm saying, look, they understand, and they're not the only ones. This is an archive that I grew up in, right? I am a member of this community, and for me, this is an ordinary way of being, right? But I wanted to figure out how that ordinariness was not translatable, to go back to your question, right? Why is this not worthy of historical translation, even though everyone knows who this collectivity is? Now, remember, this collectivity is not just also members of these famous singers. 90% of this collectivity is lower caste people who live in extreme poverty, and the major function of this collectivity is still one of reform and uplift and extension. I went to college with scholarships from this community. My parents were the first to be legally married. So this is a real subaltern community in that we have loss, right? But what I'm saying is they have refused to be defined by that. And that's an epistemological question, right? What if we begin our stories without an assumption of erasure? That to me is a radical move away, but it's a radical move that is ordinary for all of our communities who've survived. Right? So let's put the two and two together. I'm ranting, as you can see, because this is a very, this is a project, thankfully, that continues to excite me, even though I'm done with it. So
no, it excites many of us, I have to say, because it's about an attunement, right? It's also about an attunement to that particular plenitude that is already there for a lot of people. And I think that's something that ends up being then sometimes a cause of particular shame for communities that have to, you know, again, going to the graduate students that a lot of the grad students in the audience, you know, there's a kind of plenitude sometimes that, you know, intuitively is there, but then, you know, you have to then corral, right, in the kind of particular way of finding, right, a politics in that, right? And I think like that's why the kind of expectation of political salvation is key. Like, what are the kinds of ways that these are reiterated within particular archival pragmatisms, which you call, right? Like, which I think is really, you know, important. I think, like, I'm just looking at the question box. It seems like folks are, you know, I mean, it's the question, another question I had was similar. So is there any other questions from the audience before we begin wrapping up our conversations today? Okay, so I just wanted to thank Dr. Arundekar for visiting us and just, again, giving us a lot to think about as we now go on to the proceedings for the day.